Good morning. Today is the 7th day of Elul, the 24th of August. We're up to the 5th reading in Parashat Teitzei. It's very, very short. And it covers two topics that are seemingly unconnected. In fact, they're so unconnected that you probably know that the chapters in the Torah, in the Bible, in the entire Bible, were not originally done by Jews. It was actually done by a Christian bishop sometime, I believe, in the 13th century. And it was done in order to make it easier to refer to passages, to verses. The verses are from Moses, the division into verses, but the original Hebrew, the original Jewish division of the Torah was into what we call sedras, which is very different, and there were far fewer than there are chapters. So the chapters actually made it easier to refer to things, but where the chapter divisions come is not actually a real division in the Torah. Usually, though, we find that the chapter was done in what we call the end of a parshia. Parshia is, in the Torah scroll, there's an empty space. It could be empty all the way to the end of the line, or an empty space just in the middle of the line. So there's actually, again, in our reading today, there's only 6 verses, and the 6 verses divide actually into 3 topics, and two major divisions, but also like 3 topics. So let's read it, and then you'll see what I mean. It says, "When you enter a fellow Israelite's vineyard, you may eat as many grapes as you want until you are full, but you must not put any in your vessel." And this is talking about somebody who's working there. It's not that I just walked into someone's vineyard and I decided to eat from his grapes. That is permitted, by the way, in a sabbatical year. In a sabbatical year, the grapes are what we call hefker. Hefker means that they don't belong to anyone, and then you can do that. But in a regular time, you can't walk into somebody's vineyard and take things. This is talking about somebody who's working for the owner of the vineyard. So while he's working, that's what they call here, when you enter a fellow Israelite's vineyard, you may eat as many grapes as you want until you are full, but you must not put any in your vessel, meaning you can't take them home. You can't save them for later. Then the second law, which is very connected to it, very similar, when you enter a fellow Israelite's field of standing grain, you may pluck ears with your hand, but you must not put a sickle to your neighbor's grain. And here the same thing applies, except that to get the stalks of grain, you have to usually use a sickle. So it's telling you can't do it in that way, because that would be already like a commercial use of it. You're getting a lot of it. And the point is that you should be able to use whatever you need when you're working. So those are the first 2 verses. And then we turn, seemingly, to a very different topic, and we're revisiting what we missed on Tuesday. We're revisiting the laws of divorce. And here we find a new law related to divorce. It says, if a man takes a woman into his household as his wife and becomes her husband, she fails to please him because he finds something obnoxious about her. That's how they translate it here, but it means he found something about her, not necessarily obnoxious, something that is improper in his eyes. And he writes her a bill of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. She leaves his household and becomes the wife of another man. Then this latter man rejects her, writes her also a bill of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his household. Or the second man who married this woman, dies. Then the first husband who divorced her shall not take her into his household again to become his wife, since she has been defiled, for that would be abhorrent to God. You must not bring sin upon the land that your God is giving you as a heritage. So just to clear this up, what is it talking about? It's saying that if someone was married, a couple were married, and then the wife and husband divorced. If they divorce, there's actually a commandment. It's a mitzvah. It's a positive commandment to remarry. Because many times people who got a divorce actually figure out a little bit later that it's not much better out there. Or like we tell people a lot of times, the same issues that you had with your first wife, you're going to have with everyone else. You can't run away from the issues. They will, because people try to evade this by saying it wasn't my fault. I mean, that's the way that we talked about fault earlier this week. It's very natural for a person to think that it's not his fault, it's his wife's fault, and then they think that it's going to be any different. But when they go out there, sometimes they realize, wait a minute, this is not going to be any different, and I may as well solve these problems with my first wife. And usually there's also children, so this is a serious consideration to actually marry your wife, your divorced wife, again. And it's a commandment. It's one of the 613 commandments. So there's some talk about certain people who did this on purpose, who divorced their wife to perform one commandment, because divorce is also a commandment when you don't get along, and then remarry, because that's also a commandment. But assuming that this is not very normal, most people don't do this. And I remember there was one case, I can't mention names, that from the time that I met this person, Rav Ginsburg kept telling me he's divorced and he should remarry his first wife, because it was clearly the right shidduch, it was the right couple, but they didn't get along for a while. Now they could get along. In the end, they never ended up getting married again. But let's go back to what's going on here. Now, after she's divorced, she marries another man. In that case, the first husband cannot take her back if she's divorced again. Now, why would that be? So the answer is actually very simple. The reason, as it says here, is because she has been defiled. Very strange. Why use this type of language? So there's a few different answers in the Talmud, but I'll say that the point here is that really it's not the word defiled. It is defiled. He calls it abhorrent. Why would it be abhorrent if she's already married to someone else and they're divorced, so now she comes back to the original husband? What's wrong with that? Because we think like normal people, but there are people who don't think like normal people. And they think like this, and this actually, everybody spells this out. It's called switching partners. So people are married to someone, and they say you're not allowed to be with someone else's wife, but no problem. I'll just divorce my wife, he'll divorce his wife, we'll switch for tonight, and then tomorrow we'll get married again. So that's what the Torah is trying to uproot, that people don't do this, because that is considered to be abhorrent. In fact, I think I already said this once, that the word in Hebrew to'eva sounds very similar to the Polynesian word taboo. And it's a taboo to do this, to switch wives. Even if you divorce her, because the whole divorce is just a ploy to be able to make it, as it were, permissible. But it's not permissible. It's considered to be something that destroys the land. And when we say destroys the land, we need to say something more. The Torah is very, and I think we should also be, suspicious of someone who doesn't get married and doesn't have children. I'll give you an example. We say that on the high holy days, like now, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that are coming up, you shouldn't let a man who's not divorced and doesn't have children be the chazan, be the one who's leading the prayers. And the reason that the sages say this is because a person like this does not know what responsibility is. And more importantly, he doesn't know what the compassion of a father upon his children is. And so when he prays to God, he can't represent us because he doesn't understand that very, very basic human concept. And this is something I haven't heard being talked about in all the debates about marriage and different types of marriage and so on and so forth. To be married is to enter human society. When someone is married, I know that the last thing that they're going to want to do is endanger their family. And so this person has limits upon them. This is especially true for men. It's also true for women to some extent. Men who are married are more responsible socially. They can argue and they can fight sometimes, but they always feel that there has to be a limit. There has to be a limit on what we do, because if we can't live with each other, it means we're going to be sacrificing our family life. We're going to be sacrificing our families. Our families are going to get hurt. We have to have limits, meaning this whole concept of war is not very prevalent if a person is married and has children, because nobody wants to send their children into the line of fire. And it changes the whole thing. In fact, it also works the other way around, that if you are married and you have children, there are certain things you shouldn't do, which is, for instance, take care of, if the guy is the president of the United States and his children were kidnapped or something like that, he shouldn't be the one running the attempt to save them, because he's going to do things that are reckless in his attempt to save his children. But again, usually what it does is it limits a person's recklessness. It limits what they're willing to do and not willing to do. Now, I said that there's a connection between these 6 verses. And the connection is very interesting. It has to do with the world of Adam and Eve. In the world of Adam and Eve, what were they like? It says that when God placed them in the Garden of Eden, it was in order to work the garden, lo'ovda u'leshamra, to work it and to protect it. So they were workers. They were on the status of somebody who's entering someone else's vineyard or somebody else's field and working it. So what do they get? They obviously get to eat from it. And that was the earliest enactment of these 2 verses, that you come into a vineyard or you come into a grain field, and actually the sages say that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was either grain, or it was a vine, or it was a fig tree. So back then they were permitted to eat everything except for the tree of knowledge. It's like they're a worker that's working the garden. But what happened? It says that God, Vayigaresh Hashem Elokim et Adam. Vayigaresh is the same word. He pushed out the man and his wife from the Garden of Eden. But the word that's used, that he chased them out, it's like he chased them out, that word is gerushin, is the Talmudic word for divorce. And actually what happened is that there's a description like this in the Medrash, that it was a divorce between man and God. Meaning man was now like a divorced woman. And there's a very important principle that we just learned, that if you get married again, you can't go back to your first husband. This idea that if man decides to marry something else, and there were things that they decided to marry, for instance, once they came out of the Garden of Eden, there were those who worshipped idols. That was like marrying another husband, having someone else. And so idolatry puts you in the status where you can't come back to God, as it were. It's like you're this woman who now has no connection. And even if the husband wants to bring her back, he can't. And so this whole thing is a topic in and of itself. I'm sorry we ran out of time. I was going to talk a little bit more about it, but it sets up the basis of what it means to be in a state of divorce. And actually, and I'll say this just in one sentence, when a woman is divorced and she's no longer connected to her husband, the Torah says actually that she is now connected. It's as if she's wed to God. She's married to God, to the Torah itself. And that becomes her husband, as it were. And this is also true about mankind now, that we are divorced from the Garden of Eden. So what we need to marry is the Torah. And that allows us then to eventually, to not be in a state of limbo, to have some connection, but then eventually to be taken back a second time by God into the Garden of Eden, meaning to be wed again to the Creator. So this needs, I realize, a little bit more development, a little bit more explanation, but this is the general idea behind today's portion, spiritually. And thank you very much for joining. and I'll see you tomorrow, God willing.
Rabbi.